Hello and welcome into part 2 of the Getting to Know Headline AMP mini-series, where we will take a deeper dive into the disease control and plant health aspects that I touched on in the first video. So you may recognize this slide from the first video where we talked about how Headline AMP really was the next iteration in BASF's plant health portfolio by trying to increase the level of disease control consistency that we got compared to Headline launched there in the mid-2000s. But I want to focus in on this video on all three of the aspects that we see in here, not only the disease control, but also how we are providing plant health benefits in the terms of the growth efficiency and then mitigating plant stress as well. So first of all, let's focus on the disease control aspect because I think that's something that is still very important. And you can see from this data that I pulled from the Crop Protection Network that Headline AMP there at the top row really has broad spectrum quality control of a lot of our key diseases that we have out there. Doesn't really have a weak spot on some of those key diseases such as gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, and so on and so forth. Especially compared to some of the other options that are in that similar mid-tier fungicide market that Headline AMP has fallen into as well. So I wanted to focus in on a couple of key diseases. First of all, tar spot, because tar spot has definitely been a huge topic of conversation here the last couple of years as we learn more about this disease and we learn more about how much of an impact it can have on our crop if it does come in at high levels of severity. One thing that we found that maybe has surprised some folks is that Headline AMP does a very good job of controlling tar spot. It consistently in a lot of our data and a lot of our trials comes out as one of the better options for controlling tar spot. This is one example from over in Indiana where a number of trials were put together, and you can see that Headline AMP did a good job of controlling tar spot, kept that level of disease below 10%, which is something that a lot of the other fungicides that were tested here can't necessarily say. So it did work its way up towards the top in terms of the level of control that it was able to achieve. And then we see a similar story from a similar trial up in Wisconsin, again focused in on tar spot, where Headline AMP applied at full tassel actually provided the second best level of tar spot control out of the entire trial. I also wanted to focus really quickly on another disease, southern rust, that just like tar spot, if it does come in at high levels, can have a pretty significant impact on our crop. And pulled some data from a study that was conducted a few years ago down in Kentucky and Tennessee, where we included Headline AMP at a couple different rates. And you can see that Headline AMP rate at the high rate of 14.4 fluid ounces per acre does a really good job of controlling southern rust, even compared to a product such as Trivapro. And at the end of the day, this trial actually, Headline AMP, that high rate, actually ended up being the highest yielding treatment out of that trial as well. So you can see that Headline AMP across some very key diseases does a really good job of providing quality control. Okay, now we're going to switch gears away from the disease control and focus in on more of those abiotic factors like the growth efficiency and how we help those crops mitigate or how we help their response to environmental stresses. First of all, focusing in on the growth efficiency aspect, what we found is that when we apply a product such as Headline AMP, we actually increase the production of nitrate reductase within these plants, which at the end of the day allows those crops to more efficiently utilize nitrogen, which leads to a lot of other positive reactions within the plants, like increased utilization of resources and increased energy production, which is going to lead to stronger, healthier crops, which you can see really good examples of in these pictures, where utilizing a plant health fungicide allowed for more robust root growth, which is going to result in stronger, healthier crops. Switching gears over to the environmental stress portion, what we found is that we can actually influence a couple of key different factors that happen when our corn crop, for example, is exposed to some sort of environmental stress. So what happens when these crops get stressed? First of all, ethylene is produced. We can see the closure of stomata occur, and then we see the production of reactive oxidative species. And all three of these things are going to combine to have a negative impact on our crop and potentially decrease our yield potential. So something that we have found is that when we apply a product like Headline Amp is that we can actually inhibit the production of ethylene. So ethylene is a hormone that is produced as a natural response to stresses within the plant that causes that plant to start to shut down and try to produce seed in response to that stress. But that's something that we want to try to prevent so that that plant and that crop is not shutting down too early, and we're continuing to allow it to produce yield and focus on growth efficiency and trying to maximize that yield potential instead of shutting down too early. And we proved this through the graph that you can see here, which the higher the bar, the more ethylene inhibition, or the more we are preventing the production of ethylene, which if we're preventing the production of ethylene, we are stopping that plant from shutting itself down too soon. You can see a really good visual representation of that over on the right side of the screen here, where we sprayed a cornfield in strips with a plant health product from BASF following a pretty significant hail event. And you can see that the side-by-side comparisons are very drastic in terms of how much of a benefit we were able to provide to that crop purely as a response to the stress that was presented to it. Another thing that we see occur in these plants when ethylene is produced is actually the closure of stomata on the leaves, especially when we're in drought type scenarios. And that can also have a negative impact on the crop because those stomata are what allows a corn crop to regulate its own temperature and try to maintain that cool temperature, which we all know corn likes that cool temperature and cool canopy. So if we are able to inhibit or reduce ethylene production like we get with Headline Amp, we allow that plant to keep its stomata open, which allows it to regulate its temperature and maintain a cooler canopy and cooler temperature, which at the end of the day keeps that crop happier and more able to focus on growth efficiency and, again, maximizing our yield. The last point that I wanted to hit on was the production of reactive oxidative species as a result of stress. This is something that occurs in plants, and it also occurs within our own bodies, in human bodies, as a result of stress. And these reactive oxidative species are something that we want to avoid because they can be very destructive within our bodies and within our cells by puncturing cell walls and disrupting structures within our cells and destroying DNA, which at the end of the day is going to eventually result in cell death, which is obviously something that we want to avoid. Another benefit that we have found from a product such as Headline Amp is the increased production of antioxidants within these crops, which counteracts these reactive oxidative species and reduces the amount of damage that they can cause. So we were able to illustrate this as well by spraying a chemical on some corn plants that causes reactive oxidative stress. But before we did that, we sprayed a number of fungicides on these plants to see how it influenced that reaction. And you can see that the BASF plant health product was able to minimize the negative impacts that those reactive oxidative species were able to cause by that increased antioxidant production. So these were just a few examples of some of the plant health benefits that Headline Amp can provide, both in the arena of disease control, but also in how we can positively impact these plants and allow them to have a better reaction to stresses that are going on around them, potentially even in the absence of disease. So if you have more questions about these benefits, feel free to reach out to your local BASF rep, and we would be happy to talk about that some more with you. But also tune in for the final video where we will tie all of this together and focus on how the benefits that I just talked about in these videos are going to impact our yield and have a positive benefit on our crop in terms of yield and other benefits as well that we can actually see in the field. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next video.